A man is found unconscious on Archer Road. He's bleeding from the back of his head. His airway is partially blocked. His oxygen saturation has dropped to 83. His body is locked in a rigid, involuntary posture that only happens with catastrophic brain injury. This is not speculation. This is not a theory. This is what Alachua County Fire Rescue documented the moment they arrived. And yet, Gainesville Police Department told the family there was no reason to secure the scene. No reason to treat this as anything serious. No reason to do a full investigation. Today, Channy Jackson read that report aloud. And what she revealed changes everything. Let's start with what the paramedics recorded. Tyrone Davis Jr. was found unresponsive. He had what they called altered mental status and a chief complaint of following rolling from a moving vehicle. But that was just the information they were given. What they saw told a different story. His blood pressure was low. His oxygen saturation was 83. Anything below 90 is a medical emergency. They put him on a nasal cannula at 6 liters, 3 times the normal rate. He had snoring respirations, which means his airway was partially blocked. His tongue or throat was collapsing. They had to suction him repeatedly. They tried to put a cervical collar on him, the rigid brace that stabilizes the neck. They couldn't. Every time they attempted, his body would tense and posture. So instead, a rider from another ambulance rode in the back, holding his head and neck manually the entire trip to the hospital. That's not a minor injury. That's a life or death situation. Here's where it gets even more devastating. EMS uses something called the Glasgow Coma Scale to measure a person's level of consciousness. A score of 15 means you're fully awake and aware. 13 to 14 is mild injury. 9 to 12 is moderate. 8 or below is severe brain injury or coma. Tyrone's score was 4. His eyes, 1, no eye opening. His verbal response, 1, no response to voices, no words. His motor response, 2, only reflexive, involuntary movements. No response to pain. The only movement they saw was decerebrate posturing, that rigid, unnatural extension of the arms and legs that indicates severe damage to the brain stem. It's the body's last reflexive response before complete shutdown. This wasn't a person who jumped out of a car and walked away. This was a person whose brain was already shutting down before he ever left that road. Now, let's talk about what law enforcement was supposed to do. According to standard protocols, when you find a person in this condition on a roadway with a head injury, with no clear explanation of how it happened, you secure the scene. You identify witnesses. You separate them. You take independent statements. You locate the vehicle. You photograph the blood patterns, the debris, the position of the body. You treat the location as a potential crime scene until evidence rules it out. They did none of that. They left bystanders to hold Tyrone in a recovery position. They let Lulu leave the scene. They didn't take pictures. They didn't document the blood patterns. Days later, the family came back and found the pizza box still there. And here's the detail that should make everyone stop. The paramedics who arrived thought Lulu was Tyrone's sister. Why? Because the report says his sister was on the scene. A trained first responder looked at her behavior and thought she was a sibling, not a girlfriend. They didn't see a partner in distress. They saw someone whose demeanor was so off that they assumed a different relationship entirely. We now have multiple reports from multiple agencies. Glasgow County, Alachua County Fire Rescue, the medical examiner, and every one of them tells a slightly different version of what Lulu said. One report says she told them he tripped and fell at the cabin. Another says he rolled out of the vehicle. Another says he jumped. In the same dispatch communications, her story changed from he asked to get out to he jumped out going 25 miles an hour. The paramedics wrote that he was found following rolling from a moving vehicle. They didn't write jumped. They wrote what they were told at the scene. And even that version changed. GPD told the family her story was consistent, but the documents from every other agency say otherwise. Here's what the medical evidence tells us with absolute certainty. Whatever happened to Tyrone happened after he left Papa John's. The severity of his injury, the decerebrate posturing, the oxygen crash, the Glasgow Coma Scale of 4, means his brain was under extreme stress almost immediately. He didn't have hours of decline. He had minutes. He had no other injuries. No road rash. No abrasions on his arms, his legs, his face. His white tank top was clean. The only injuries were multiple blunt force trauma to the back of his head and scratches on his neck. Scratches that looked like fingernails. This is not the profile of a man who jumped from a moving vehicle. It's the profile of someone who was struck in the back of the head with enough force to cause catastrophic brain injury, then collapsed. The family is still waiting for GPD to release their records. Still waiting for answers. Still waiting for accountability. On March 28th, they will be in Gainesville. They have requested a joint press conference with GPD to answer the public's questions, to explain why the scene wasn't secured, why the black box wasn't pulled, why witnesses weren't interviewed, why the family was told one thing while the evidence shows another. Channy was clear. The reports she read tonight were available to GPD. They had every piece of information needed to know this was serious. They chose not to act. So where does this leave us? The evidence is stacking. The medical records, the witness statements, the timeline gaps, the inconsistent stories, the injury that doesn't match the narrative. And still, GPD insists this was an accident. If a person is found unconscious on a roadway with a Glasgow Coma Scale of 4, bleeding from the back of the head, with no other injuries, and the only witness gives 3 different versions of what happened, is that an accident? Or is that a failure to investigate? The family is doing the work that GPD should have done. They're gathering records. They're consulting experts. They're reconstructing the timeline. And every new document confirms what they've been saying from the beginning. Something happened here, and law enforcement let it slip away. The question now is, will anyone be held accountable? This is True Crime Unraveled. Share this video. Keep asking questions. Keep demanding answers. March 28th, Gainesville. The family will be there. Drop your thoughts in the comments. We read every single one. Justice for Dro.
Good afternoon. Happy Wednesday. So I'm going to take a few seconds while I get all my stuff together. Allow people to actually get on this live. I'm doing this in between my evening meetings while I got a break, so that people, even once they get off from work and things like that, they can actually come back and watch this particular live video. So I want to be clear for people that are tuning into this one. This is the patient care record from Alachua County Fire Rescue. And I'm probably going to say this a few times throughout the video, that this one is a bit heavy. So if you're a person that is not prepared, it actually talks about Dro's condition. I want to state that ahead of time. Before I actually get into reading the report, what I want to lay out is I'm going to read the report, and then I'm going to go through and explain what things in the report actually mean and the implications of GPD's actions or GPD's inaction as it related to Dro in this particular case. One of the things that I want to name, and I was very clear with the actual family, that even with the information I had, I wanted to validate the family's position that they were absolutely correct. Once the research team came aboard, once talking to the PI and all the things that they're uncovering, I said we're now starting to really get a lot of clarity. And as we start to get more information, it looks like that information is going to start to validate exactly what it is that you all thought. And that's more and more. I'm so disturbed about what is actually in this report, because I replayed when we went to meet with GPD and they stated that they didn't have a reason to secure the scene, when this report makes it very, very clear that they had every reason in the world to secure this scene and to actually talk to witnesses. There is no way that they can make me believe that they did not breach their own standard operating procedures. It's literally impossible. I want to make sure that I clarify. I am aware, yes, I'm still getting the communications of misinformation that is purposely being sown. And so for me, it's about making sure that we're very clear. I know that after I read the report from Gilchrist County, that you all started to get live videos and posts that referenced that one of the people that Dro talked to was a person named Gabe, and I didn't say that person's name. And that the person that Kiara talked to was a person named Arthur. The reason that I did not name those people's names is because all the evidence makes it very clear that what took place that caused Dro to lose his life did not happen in Gilchrist County. So involving people that have nothing to do with the actual situation at hand, that's creating the chaos. The fact that there's been like 12 people that have been involved and engaged, and the more information that you actually get makes it very clear what actually took place. It's just a level of insanity, and I want to state that. I know that it's been shared that people state that they already had body-worn camera footage after we're starting to release that. They already had these reports. My deal is, if you did, then why are these things not with GPD? It's not a point to prove to you all or to anyone else. The whole purpose of this is justice for this particular family and accountability for what law enforcement did not do, and that's why family has not gotten the justice that they're actually entitled to for their loved one. And so I want to name like these things. I want to center that this is about the person who lost his life. I know that some people reached out and sent screenshots, and they were stating that this is T2's father's fault because he called his father for a ride. That is not true, but even if it were, T2 is an adult. And I'm going to be very clear with you. And anybody know my daddy was a gangster. He was an original OG. And one thing my father would never do was get into our personal business. And he'll always tell you the story. I got an aunt that was going with a well-known guy here, and the guy broke my aunt's neck. My aunt was actually in the hospital when he broke her neck. My dad went and chased that boyfriend down. If you're from Gainesville, you know where Eastwood Meadows is, right by Eastside High School. Eastwood had a bunch of woods. He chased the dude down in the woods, beat the dude ass, and broke the dude neck because the dude broke his sister neck. And when the dude was laid up in the hospital with a broke neck, do you know what my aunt was? At the hospital next to the bed with her neck brace on. And that lesson that my dad had long before I ever was adult enough to have relationships is that you don't get into people's personal relationships, because you will do all of that and they will be together. And while that is very, very uncomfortable, and that's why even too in DV situations they're very difficult to navigate, this is one of those situations where it wasn't he was trying to leave. It seems like they were going into their typical back and forth banter and those particular things. Additionally, when it came to the person, Gabe, who did talk to them, they were very clear. The last conversation that they had with T2, things seemed like they had evened out and things had calmed down. So all of this false finger pointing and all of these fake flags and false narratives, we don't have time for that. Let's stay focused. Let's stay square and center about what took place. So I want to state that with this report, it was actually written at 5:57 p.m. So we know in another report that it was reported in the Gilchrist County report that he was found at 5:46. The reason I'm naming these times is because as we get all of the data, we want to be very, very streamlined as it pertains to actually rebuilding and recreating the actual timeline. What they did is they got all of T2's information that they could get. They did have his actual information because his wallet was there on the scene. They stated that he did have what is called altered mental status. Once I go through the report, I will talk to you more about what that is. They stated that his chief complaint was altered mental status, followed rolling from a moving vehicle, and then it says falls on a street or a roadway. When they ask about history like medications, allergies, they couldn't get that because the patient was unresponsive. They don't know what his pain was because he was unresponsive. His blood pressure was a little bit elevated for the lower number. And actually, as they did another blood pressure, he was what's called hypotensive. His blood pressure was actually low. His O2 sats. So your O2 sats is the amount of O2 saturation in the blood. Though that needs to be in the upper 90s. His was all the way down to 83. So that would have been a major concern. He was so even at 1758. So immediately he was on a trauma alert. And I want to state that because when we met with GPD, they stated the reason that they didn't secure the scene is because they didn't have a reason to think that it was serious, when literally at the time before they actually sent him to the hospital, he was immediately on a trauma alert. Additionally, when they did what they call his oxygen, they put him on nasal cannula, which is oxygen where they put it through his nose, and then they did a flow rate of 6, which is pretty high. Typically, even when you're in the hospital, they put you on nasal cannula of about 2 liters. For him, they put it on 6, which is a lot. They said he had snoring respirations. I want you to remember that, because if you ever hear anybody talks about being near death, they talk about a death rattle. And sometimes you'll hear that with snoring respirations. When I get further down to explain all the medical lingo, I want to make sure that's something that stood out to me. Also, he required what's called intermittent suction, where they needed to go out and suction out any of the mucus and things like that he had. Now, these are things that either happen on the scene, on the road, or on the hospital, in the ambulance, the short distance to the actual hospital. And of course, they gave him saline, and you know saline, that's actual fluids. So with his mental status, they say he was unresponsive, rolled out of his vehicle, and they believed that he had a head injury. So they did an assessment. With his skin, he had no injuries. So I'm going to go down other things that they saw when they did what's called HENT. So they do like your head, they do your ears, your nose, your throat, all that kind of stuff, your face, to see what's going on. They said he had bleeding and minor injury to the back of the head. He had decerebrate posturing, which is what I told you that the research team actually was able to determine with the information that they had, which is why it's clear that law enforcement should have been able to see this, and said he had painful stimuli, snoring respirations. And I'm going to explain that as we get further down. When they did a neurological assessment, he had the decerebrate posturing, which I'm going to explain some more. And then they said his abdomen, which they checked, it was soft and it was not tender. So when they stated they got there, they had a 35-year-old male that was non-responsive. Upon arrival, being held in a recovery position left on the side by bystanders. So what they're stating is, mind you, you had other first responders, you had law enforcement that was there, but you still had the bystanders that were the ones that had him in a recovery position, which is supposed to be a safety position. They said he was found incontinent, which I told you from the research team, they saw from the puddles and things in the pictures that he used the bathroom on himself. I'm going to tell you why that's important when we get further down. With bleeding from a minor hematoma, which is the bruise on the back of the head, and unresponsive to verbal stimuli, which means even if they're talking to him, they couldn't do which is called orient him. When you orient somebody, you're asking, questions. Do you know your name? Do you know the day of the week? Do you know what year it is? Do you know who the president is? Or even when they verbal stimuli, you can see movement with the eyes and stuff like that. He was not responsive to any of that. Bystanders were concerned because they thought he might have been struck by a car, because no one could advise how he became unresponsive on the side of Archer Road. As the patient was rolled onto his back, the patient began to tense and posture, which is the decerebrate posturing that I told you about. His C-spine, which is a spine that actually runs back here in the back of the neck and the brainstem, where the spinal cord is, was manually held as the patient was lifted onto our stretcher, and all seatbelts and rails were secured. I want you to remember that I told you that his C-spine had to be held manually, because that's important. Once in the ambulance, a C-collar placement was attempted as the IV was secured, but patient continued to posture, so they could not hold it long enough to put on a C-collar. They gave him Versed, so that's actually to calm him down with the pain, in a second line, and fluids were administered. A trauma alert was issued, so that's why he went to the hospital under a trauma name, and the patient was transported emergently to Shands. So I want to be clear, the trauma alert was issued before he left to go to the hospital, which means law enforcement on the scene would have actually known that. And that's important about what law enforcement should have actually done. So then it says, a rider from E9 maintained manual C-spine and hold en route. So that means a rider from one of their other ambulances actually came and held his C-spine. They advised his sister was on the scene, and his sister advised that they had an argument that occurred between the two siblings and resulted in the patient rolling out of her vehicle at an unknown speed and possibly striking his head in the process. The patient's sister was unable to advise past medical history or blood thinner use. Patient continued to present with snoring respirations due to inability to get clear O2 saturations, and patients' O2 sats did improve en route because they were given oxygen. All vitals were monitored with no further changes noted. Upon arrival to Shands, the patient was slid from our stretcher to the hospital bed, maintaining manual C-spine. Report was given to trauma team and all signatures were obtained. CC3 was cleaned and put back in service, awaiting family arrival for next of kin. So I want to make sure that you all caught what I stated. In this report, it was reported that his sister was the person that was on the scene, and there was an argument in his vehicle. So yet again, this is a trained person that does not know either people. From the information that they were collected, they were told that this was his sister. I want to state this because I want to remind you that the witnesses that were on the scene stated that they did not know that Lulu was his partner because she did not act like a partner on the scene. I want to remind you, because they stated that she was a doting partner, how is it that the people from Alachua County Fire Rescue came to think that that was his actual sister? So I want to name that. So I went through and I read to you what the actual report is. And I wanted to do that first and then take the time to break down to you the concerns that I actually have. So I went through and I actually took notes, which is typically what I do. And the reason that I take notes, because when I go back and I engage whatever entity it is, whether it's law enforcement, we go back and we look. So then we would say, well, okay, this is what we think the expected response should be. And these are areas of concern if things weren't responded to in this particular manner. The reason that I walk through official reports is so that we can look through the gaps. I told you when I first started to be forward facing, and this is what I explained to the family, this is how we get to the root of actually what happened, to get to a point to understand what happened, to understand if it rises to the form of criminality, to understand if it was an accident, just so we can understand what happens, to understand next steps. So for me, we know that the medical report establishes what? He was unresponsive. He was suffering from a head injury and was bleeding from the back of the head. He was incontinent, which means that his neurological function was compromised. So we know neurological means something happened with either his brainstem or his spinal cord. So I want to state that. Snoring respirations means that his airway was either partially blocked or obstructed, which means that's very, very serious. When we get further down, I'll talk to you about there's like a coma scale that they actually use. And so that's one of the signs that's like on a coma scale. And then this decerebrate posturing means that it's a critical neurological sign. So remember, if you watch the video that myself and Natalie did when we did the report back from the research team, when you have this decerebrate posturing, they believe that the injury happened and then his neurological decline happened pretty quickly. That's the reason they were able to narrow down from the timeline that whatever took place after Papa John's. It is impossible for what happened and for all of the actual medical evidence for anything to have happened in Gilchrist County. That is the reason that we're not having any additional conversations about Gilchrist County, because the medical information shows that this had to happen after they left Papa John's. So, and then also when him requiring manual C-spine stabilization throughout transport and care, that means he was in such serious condition that he could not be able to be stabilized with a C-collar. So then we'll go, when we talk about unresponsive, that means he was not awake, he could not communicate, he was not responding to voice, so he was not responding even to painful stimuli. So those signals alone showed that he had a brain-related emergency. So these are things that law enforcement is trained to know about, so they should have known that they should have been investigating this as a serious manner, period. So then when we talk about this decerebrate posturing, this is one of the most critical findings in the entire report. I had goosebumps reading this part because the research team from across the country, this is literally one of the things that they named, and they gave a breakdown. Mind you, they did this with the information that they had available before they ever had this report. So literally this report aligns with their findings like in a straight line, like directly. It's a whole puzzle piece that fits. Posturing is not a normal movement. It is an involuntary response that indicates severe brain injury, often involving the brainstem. It typically means the brain is under extreme stress or damage and the person is in a critical or near fatal condition. The snoring respirations indicates an airway problem. The tongue or airway structures are partially blocking airflow, which can lead to oxygen deprivation if not managed immediately. And that was one of the reasons for the O2 oxygen saturations. And with his O2 sats being down to 83, we know that actually mimics that, mirrors that. Then with the manual C-spine stabilization. So with them documenting this, they had to manually hold his head and neck still all the way to the hospital, even during transport, because they could not safely place a cervical collar on his neck. This is important because they believed that he had a possible spinal cord injury that is so severe that improper movement could have caused paralysis, could stop his breathing, or lead to death. So this lets you know that this is a high-risk trauma situation. Law enforcement is hearing these communications. So how do you not secure a scene when you found some person on a roadway that's in this severe of a state? So when you combine all of these things together, you got unresponsiveness, you got the posturing, you got the head injury, you got a compromised airway, and you got all these spinal precautions. You understand that this is a critical trauma patient in a life or death situation. The things that the EMS did, which were all correct, they called a trauma alert, they provided oxygen and airway support, they gave the IV fluids, they maintained the proper spinal precautions, and they transported him emergently to the trauma center. All of those things were correct. Things that stand out to me in this case that kind of were unclear. They minimized the movement to protect the spine, so we know that part. They gave the immediate recognition, and I want to highlight what was done right as I talk about what wasn't done correctly, so that everybody has a full understanding, and not even just for this case, but proceeding forward. So also, some of the concerns are, we know that by the time they got there, that they had first responders that were witnesses and bystanders. So now a question that I have waiting for the stuff from GPD, did law enforcement arrive first or did EMS arrive first? Because then at that time, it would have been the responsibility would be on law enforcement. From the videos that I saw, they still had the witnesses as the ones administering care, while law enforcement is just kind of standing around like a bump on a log. These things are very important because they are trained first responders. It is their responsibility. And so I want to state that. Also, because bystanders didn't know what happened, they didn't know even what they should be doing, so they did the best they could with what they had. Because there was this uncertainty of what the trauma that caused it, because you didn't know it was a vehicle accident, because you didn't know it was a possible assault or a serious event, law enforcement was supposed to secure and control the scene. They were supposed to secure the area, they were supposed to limit access to prevent contamination, and they were supposed to treat the location as a potential evidence scene. They didn't do any of that. You can see on the videos that everybody's in the area. You know after the fact that everything was still left there and that the family are the ones who went and found the pizza box and all the other stuff. So with this being a medical emergency, you understood that it had to be an investigative scene, even if you didn't know if it was an accident or criminal. They should have been identifying all individuals present. They should have separated them. They should have collected independent statements. Remember, the witnesses were identified because the family are the people that came forward, and then the witnesses actually reached out to the family and said, hey, I was the person that was actually present. The fact that they didn't even document appropriately who actually found them, and the fact that they hadn't even followed up with all of the witnesses even by the time that we had met. How is it that you felt like you've done this full investigation when there's so many basic missteps? Other things that they should have done is at that time they should have located Lulu's vehicle. She should not have been able to drive away from the scene because she stated that he rolled out of her vehicle. They should have been looking for damage. They should have been looking for biological evidence at that time. They should have been looking for any impacts, even if they were ruling out that he got hit by a car. All of this stuff should have been documented and its condition should have been done very thoroughly. These things were actually not done. Things that should have been documented, which, and this they may have, we don't know, because we still haven't gotten the records from GPD. The exact position his body was found in, the distance and the measurements from the roadway, the blood patterns, physical surroundings, debris or indicators of any of the impact. What was actually clear as well is he had no other scratches or anything except for the scratches on the back of the neck that looked like they came from fingernails. So the fact that he had multiple blunt force trauma to the back of the head, which is where your brainstem and spinal cord is, and just scratches on the back of the neck, his tank top, everything was clear. Like, GPD, I don't know. Investigators, even within, they should have done better about establishing the timeline. We're getting the timeline because of the work that we're actually doing. We're figuring out what things happened. They clearly stated to us that her story didn't change, but I'm showing you different stories from every single agency that she talked to. How is it that her story didn't change when we're getting all the information that you all are supposed to have in your possession, and we went to other entities to get it because y'all haven't turned over the information that we actually need? And so it's all very, very suspicious. Also, what's suspicious is he had no other injuries, but he had this very highly suspicious injury to the back of the head and the back of his C-spine. So the fact that this was so severe and they still said, well, oh, doop-de-doo, we don't know what happened, but it's going to be an accident, does not make sense. It's just very disingenuous, and it's not factually correct. This was not a minor injury. And the fact that they've tried to present it as if the family was very just over the top or being very emotional and not being reasonable, and that's not actually what happened. I'm so very upset about that. Other things that need clear answers. Yes, we know there was an argument. So the reason we were told the argument was even by this law enforcement. So GPD said one reason. The Gilchrist County Sheriff's Office says that it was about infidelities. Now they're saying that the sister and brother was arguing. Well, the sister and brother not going to be arguing about infidelities. So how is it that even the arguments and what they are were different? So then you're saying he ended up outside of the vehicle. So we know the mechanism of how he got out of the car. We don't know if he actually stepped out. We don't know if he fell. We don't know if he was pushed. We don't know if he jumped. We don't know any of this because literally the story changed, and it's a different story by the people who all were even at the same scene. For the clarity for me is, I see one report that says he was found at 5:46. This report was written at 5:57. So now we want the additional information. We're still waiting on the CAD calls to be able to further fill in the blanks for the timeline. We know the pizza box at 5:18. My position is that the time that the pizza actually comes out of the oven. Another position is that might be in some pizza places, that's the time that the pizza goes in the oven. So we got to figure that part out. Or was it the time that the pizza was actually ordered? Because we're trying to piece together and what time frame did this actually take place. This is what GPD should have been doing. We're actually doing it and getting the ability to do that by the time that the calls came in, by understanding that pizza box is great information. Additionally, I do believe the family also has the receipt when it's ordered, so we're piecing those things together. And the research team and the private investigator, these are the gaps that they're helping to fill in. Other things, so even if they had done what they were supposed to do with the actual witnesses, we know he was found unresponsive, we know he was left on the roadway, like those particular things, but the fact that you waited, were there other witnesses that we don't know about because you all didn't properly connect all the information? They were supposed to get as much witness statements as possible that day, and they keep saying, well, we didn't think that it was anything serious. I am assured, and that's the reason that I asked for the standard operating procedures, that you knew that you were supposed to do these things because of the seriousness of his actual condition. I'm so very, very disturbed. Another gap, still no confirmed cause of the injury. The scene is still described as uncertain. It was even uncertain for EMS. No clear documentation of the actual vehicle, the positioning, any of those things. The fact that everything was accepted at face value, although the actual scene does not actually even match the statement, is a level of absurdity that I will not understand. How? And I want to know this. I don't believe a trained professional who does this all the time just willy-nilly came up with that they thought Lulu was his sister. How did that come about? What was her body language? What was the behavior? What was the interaction for them to believe that his girlfriend was his sister and not his girlfriend? Like, these things are just, they are beyond me. So as we keep going, as I think about other things, we still got to finish confirming the timeline. We still got to help verify the sequence actually of events, because things that are actually missing. We still have no actual confirmation of how he actually left the vehicle. Things that are still missing. They waited some time before they got the vehicle. So was there a vehicle condition that turned around and got fixed? Was there evidence that you should have secured and got off the road? Did you not take pictures of the actual blood patterns, like the actual layout? Because a lot of the things that they have are literally from the family, because it's information that GPD did not collect. Another gap, as again, who was interviewed, who still should be interviewed, were the statements appropriately separated, how were they actually gathered and they held? We don't know that, because we're still waiting on GPD's information that they seem to be holding while everybody else is releasing their stuff. Additionally, now the narrative went from he asked to get out and I stopped, to he jumped out because he was upset, to now he rolled out of the vehicle. How the hell do you roll out of a vehicle with a pizza box of wings in your hand? Like, these are all multiple statements, and the only person giving the statement was only one person at the scene to give the statement. How everybody getting a different statement when they've only had one person they could have talked to? So for me, I have so many additional questions. Y'all know there's just an inconsistency in the narrative. The medical and the injuries, they do not correlate. We're waiting from the records from the actual hospital. We want to see the scene evidence. So I don't even want to present the other questions that I have just yet, because we're still trying to see what GPD actually has. Things that I do want to state, because I know people will have questions. One of the things that I read in the report was response to painful stimuli. What that means is, because he's not responding, is the person is not awake, they're not responding to voice or touch, and they have zero or to no reaction to a pinch or pressure. So you would normally expect the person to be talking, opening their eyes normally, or following commands. He wasn't doing any of that. So these things means he was at a very, very low level of consciousness. The snoring respirations, just so we can make sure that people are clear, that means the airway is blocked, either by his tongue or his throat collapsing, or the air is struggling to pass through. You see this when people have low oxygen, brain damage, or going into cardiac arrest. So getting people to understand that part. So this lets you know that he was critical at the scene, and he was at a risk of stopping breathing at the scene, and that he was in a neurological storm, which is what the research team had already told us. So literally this report actually validates the summation of the working theory that actually was created by the research team. And then the final thing is there is what's called a Glasgow Coma Scale. So with this scale, it is basically a coma versus brain death indicators. And I wanted to share this. So they look at your eye response, they look at verbal response, and they look at your motor response. So if you do it like a 15, that means you're fully awake or normal. A 13 to 14 is mild injury. A 9 to 12 is moderate injury. And an 8 or below is severe brain injury or coma level. His score on the report was a 4. So his eyes were a 1, verbal was a 1, and motor was a 2. So that means he had no eye opening at all, no response to any voices, no responses to any pain, which means he was already in shutdown mode. So I want to share he was deeply unconscious, which shows that he had severe brain dysfunction before actually leaving the scene. And so the only movements he had were the reflexive movements, and then this decerebrate posturing that actually happened. So he had little to no brain activity there. So even with the family, as they were not notified until the day before, what is disturbing as well is because one of the things the family was told is that they were not notified until the following day is because they didn't think it was that serious. There are even reports that people called and Kiara put the phone to him knowing that this was the condition that he was actually in. This is a level of insanity. How do you put the phone next to his head to make it seem like he was okay if this is how he actually left the scene? I want to make sure that we're keeping all of the evidence and the data kind of where it is. I'm pointing those things actually out to you all. There are lots of chain of commands that were actually not followed. I want to be very, very clear that a lot of the confusion was bred because GPD did not do their part. So when many people was like, oh, well, it had to be an accident because law enforcement stated that, there is very clear that there was not a thorough investigation done, if any at all. It looks like they did just enough in order to check a box. because literally what I am reading you all are reports from the same reports that they would have gotten. So this came from Alachua County Fire Rescue. The other report was like from Gilchrist County medical examiner reports. The things that we are giving you are literally all of the information that was available to Gainesville Police Department to be able to make their determination. So I want to be clear with that. As we get these things and as we read them, as the PI goes and brings back that additional information, as the research team goes and synthesizes that stuff, I'm the person that brings it back to you all to be able to break it down so that we all have an actual understanding. I'm going to leave you with that. And I know some of you are stating to block all of the negativity and the naysayers. We're not doing that because we want it to be clear that who actually is here for justice for Dro, and actually even for the naysayers to see how you're actually supposed to work towards justice. One of the statements that even somebody kept saying, why won't the family let you know who the PI is? And the family's reference is because it's a private investigator. But not only that, talking to the PI, for them, they don't like to be known out front because it helps them when they're going out and interviewing people and getting that information when they're in particular spaces so that they don't raise red flags. Like I said, their PI has actually such a good relationship. He actually had the ability and met with the detective on the case the day before he met with me in the actual family. And so he has credentials, he has relationships that even that we don't have, and he's been able to utilize those and leverage those in this particular process. So even when I'm stating to you what some of the process actually should have been, it is because we've sat down, we've conversed, and he's walked us through what the steps are. The reason I know that the standard operating procedures are not going to mesh is because the PI has been able to share what standard operating procedures actually look like, because he actually was a sheriff's officer for 22 years here in Alachua County. So I have to go and do other things, but as I stated and as we promised, as things become available, as we go through all of the information, we want to make sure that you see on this particular journey. And again, the family will be here on March the 28th at 12 p.m. We will be having a press conference out in front of GPD. As you know, Aunt Natasha did a live video last night because she understands that the ops are trying to hinder people and make people fearful about coming out. There is no reason for people to be fearful to come out. All things we have done in order. Law enforcement and GPD has been reached out in order to do that joint press conference so that they can actually answer two things. And so we want to be very clear as it relates to that. And as you notice, things have been very consistent, they've been very transparent, and they've been in order. Y'all have a good evening.